and welcoming all of them. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Niamh. I'm Dafna Linzer. I'm the executive editor of POLITICO. We have a robust and distinguished panel that truly meets the moment on the Middle East with expertise that spans the region. So I'm going to do a quick little extra intro so that we can then dive right in to this weighty and critical topic. Professor Abbas Milani, the Director of Iranian Studies at Stanford University, Enrique Mora of Spain. Niamh just talked about his role with the Iran nuclear deal. He's the Deputy Secretary General of the European External Action Service. Ambassador Ross is no stranger to this group, a long and distinguished career at the State Department focusing on Middle East peace, and now at the Washington Institute for Near East Studies. And of course, Mona Yacoubian, a Middle East expert who has focused her work on Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, and is with the U.S. Institute of Peace. Professor Milani, I want to start with you. There's much to discuss today. It's been 15 years since I was writing about the Iranian nuclear program for the Washington Post, and back then experts in the intelligence community often spoke about gaming which would come first, a nuclear Iran or the end of public tolerance for the regime. There's been a lot of moments since then that have had U.S. presidents wondering which would come first, and there's a perception that we may be at one more now. Can you talk about what kind of an inflection point you think we're at in Iran?
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. I have to begin by explaining a conspiracy. Conspiracies are the coin of the realm. And in the Iranian view of the world, there is no one who has been more responsible for changing politics in Iran than Professor Joseph Nye. They have a whole conspiracy that Joseph Nye is the George Kennan of the new Cold War. The second culprit in all of this, again I'm quoting Khamenei, is Stanford University. Stanford University, they say, has been consistently fermenting trouble and talking against the regime. So this is the beginning of a beautiful new conspiracy as the regime is watching. And I do think we're at a very important, almost paradigmatic moment in Iranian politics and in nuclear politics. I was in favor of the deal, the nuclear deal, when it was signed. I now think it's a dead horse, and trying to revive it is reviving a dead horse at a time where the Iranian people have clearly, in my view, categorically, in my view, rejected this regime. There's no time, in my, again, experience, that there has been a movement as sustained, as democratic, as led by women, as creative in its nonviolent approach, as persevering as the movement that we now have for 3 months. I cannot believe that the international community can at this moment think about signing a deal with this regime and giving it billions of dollars that it will only use to suppress the Iranian people, agitate against US allies, and further consolidate its ties to Russia. Iran is now the most important military ally of Russia and Ukraine. Iran is one of the centers of shenanigans in the region, and that money will, I think, be used only for these nefarious purposes. The existing paradigm that worked at the time was that this is a regime that is reliable. This is a regime that is reformable. There are moderates within this regime that can be partners to a better future Iran. I think the reformists are no longer a force in Iran. I think the Iranian people want a change. They don't want the West to change the regime for them, but they want to change this regime to a more law-abiding, secular, democratic entity. And at this moment, talking about the deal with this regime, I think, is against long-term, short-term interests of the United States, Europe, US allies, and definitely the Iranian people.
Thank you for that. I think before I want to want to go to Enrique and Mora, obviously, on the deal and the position of the European Union, especially in light of what of how you're assessing this situation, Professor Milani. But let me ask you before I do. Should the Islamist regime fall in some way, what do you expect will come next?
I think what will come next will depend on when this change happens. I'm not one of those who thinks this regime is going to fall tomorrow. I think there are two illusions that have been fed in Washington very conscientiously. One is the illusion that this regime is here to stay and nothing will change. The other is that this regime will fall with the next push. This is a regime that still has resilience. It has the power to suppress. They just today defiantly executed someone who's, according to their own indictment, whose crime was blocking a street. They executed a peaceful demonstrator. This regime still has some poison. So when that change happens, I think, will determine what will come. The most immediate, I think, likely scenario is that the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, will find that the times are desperate. They will take over. But I don't think that that is a solution that can solve Iran's problems. Iran's problems are so fundamental that only a national, international coalition between the Iranian diaspora that is now more organized, more united, more active than ever before, and people inside Iran, with the help of the international community, can get the Iranian economy running again and make Iran a reliable actor in the region.
Mr. Mora, with that in mind, can you talk a little bit about where the European Union thinks the Iran nuclear deal is headed, if anywhere at all?
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, thanks to Aspen for inviting me. It's really a privilege to be here. The situation now of the nuclear deal is entirely different than it was only 6 months ago. We cannot detract ourselves from the current situation, first inside Iran. Second, a point which is extremely important to the European Union. Iran is, along with North Korea, the only country in the world which is giving weapons to Russia in the war of aggression against Ukraine. And then we have the nuclear, the JCPOA. Conventional wisdom, let's put it that way, for many years, said that we have to encapsulate the nuclear question in order to put aside a huge non-proliferation problem. So JCPOA was the way to encapsulate that problem, to deal with others, regional behavior, the evolution, internal evolution of the Islamic Republic. We still think in Brussels that that is correct, but at the same time, it's absolutely obvious that this is not the moment to go for the nuclear agreement. But it's not just because of the situation on the ground. It is. It is not just because support to Russia. It is. It's fundamentally because the Iranians themselves, they have not taken the decision to go for JCPOA. They had two golden opportunities, one in March, another one in August, where we had, in fact, an agreement, but they lack the political will to go for it. And they put a technical question called safeguards before going for JCPOA. So this is the situation right now. And to all those who say that JCPOA is a dead corpse, my question is very simple. What's the alternative? How can you do? What do you want to do with the Iranian nuclear program that, by the way, is advancing at a cruise speed? Thank you.
That's pretty stark. I think we're going to come back and revisit this in a moment. But I actually want to ask Ambassador Ross to get involved. I was going to actually start off by asking you about Israel, but I want your take sort of on what you've heard just now, especially with the kind of the lack of political will in Iran. And how do you assess that? And how do you connect that lack of political will to what's happening in the street?
You know, this is a problem right now that offers you almost no solution, but it doesn't give you the choice of doing nothing. The problem we face right now is on the issue of political will. There wasn't political will to conclude the JCPOA when you made what was, quote, the final offer, and they came back with 3 conditions. Partly that was a function of the elite debate, and partly was a function of the way they negotiate. That, you know, final proposal, okay, well, let's see what else we can get. When there's a debate, it's easy for those who are saying we want more to say, let's try to get more. But I think Enrique was quite right. We're in a completely different situation right now. And it's a situation where, as Abbas said, that basically, you know, if you were to conclude the deal, this suddenly means tens of billions of dollars for the regime. So it's very difficult to see anybody wanting to conclude this deal right now. The irony is the Supreme Leader won't want to conclude the deal right now because he won't want to look weak, like he's been forced to do this. Our problem is that as the situation remains frozen from the standpoint of a diplomatic outcome, Iran is pressing ahead with its nuclear program. They've now announced they're going to produce 16 cascades of IR-6s. This is an advanced centrifuge that is 10 to 15 times as efficient as the original, the IR-1 centrifuges. They probably have a couple of bombs worth right now of enriched material to 60%. 60% is close. It's not at weapons grade, but it's close to weapons grade. They are producing uranium metal. 60% enriched uranium. Uranium metal has no justifiable civilian purpose. Don't take my word for it. Take the word for it of the director of the IAEA. And yet they're going to be pressing ahead. So we're facing a reality where a few months from now, they may have 10 bombs worth at 60%. The IAEA is not in there. It means they can begin to divert this material away. We're not going to quite know necessarily where it is. They are a threshold nuclear weapon state. They're not a nuclear weapon state yet, but they are building the wherewithal that permits them at some point to move to it relatively quickly. So on the one hand, we have no diplomacy that offers any pathway, but their program isn't frozen, it's advancing. And for me, it suggests that we need a strategy of deterrence. By that I mean the Iranians today feel they can do what they're doing and the cost is acceptable to them. In fact, they think ultimately it'll build pressure on us to be more responsive to them. We need to be able to demonstrate to them that the path they're on ultimately is going to be even more costly to them. And for me, I can give you a series of steps we could take to do that. I feel we have to focus on reestablishing deterrence, A, if we want to avoid having to use force, and B, if at some point you want some kind of diplomatic outcome, but even that has to be factored into what you were saying. You know, we cannot be in a position where we are providing a kind of fuel to the regime to sustain itself at a time what we're seeing is really unprecedented. If you go over the last 5 years, and I'll just wrap up with this, every year from 2017, as you know, there's been some event that triggered widespread demonstrations. The difference is it was never countrywide, it was never led by the youth and women, and it never led to a countrywide strike. We're witnessing a countrywide strike now. This is unprecedented in terms of the Islamic Republic. So the last thing we should be doing is focusing on how we can help them sustain themselves. And we have to figure out how we, on the one hand, we reconcile that objective with the objective of dealing with the reality that they're pushing their nuclear program ahead.
Ambassador, of course, go ahead.
There's one other difference. At no time in the last 30 years has the Islamic Republic, officials of the Islamic Republic, important officials of the Islamic Republic, openly talked about the need to develop the bomb. They have always hidden under this phantom fatwa that Khamenei has apparently issued. Now they're openly saying the fatwa should be rescinded, and why shouldn't we have it? We should be the North Korea.
Mona, can you talk a little bit about the impact of the strike and what we've seen on the street in a kind of wider regional context?
Well, I think, you know, I'd like to pull the lens back a bit and talk about the region more broadly. I mean, I think the region itself, the Arab world, is at a hinge moment where the fundamentals that have defined the region for the last 20 years have all been thrown up into the air. And we're heading into, I think, a period of many, many unknowns. The prospect of a nuclear Iran is just one of them. We're seeing protest movements, certainly prior to the pandemic in 2019 across the region, whether in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Sudan. We're seeing more restiveness in Tunisia. But I think what fundamentally defines this hinge moment is both the U.S.'s pullback from the region. Pick up the national security strategy, you'd be hard-pressed to find mention of the Middle East. You have to go pretty far down into it to find it. And, you know, the era of forever wars is really over. This is not lost on the region. And there is a perception in the region, widespread, of the U.S. is on its way out. And we're now, I think, in a new period of multipolarity in the region. And I mean, it's really important to note, on this very day, President Xi from China is in Saudi Arabia for 3 days of summits. So I think we're heading into a period of unknowns and major shifts in the geopolitics of the region. And I'm not, frankly, quite sure that our government is well postured or is really thinking through all the implications of that.
Ambassador Mora mentioned Iran's relationship with Russia and with selling weapons to Russia, including obviously the drones. Can you talk a little bit about the Russian presence in the region right now and how it's affecting Syria, how it's affecting Turkey, and Iran as well?
So, of course, Syria has been the place that has been the primary locus of Russian influence. With its invasion of Ukraine, it has clearly shifted its bandwidth, its strategic attention, and even resources from Syria to Ukraine. And that's having real effects. I think it's reordering many of the power dynamics in the very complex conflict arena that is Syria. So that you see, for example, frankly, Russia and Iran being pushed closer together. We had the example, of course, of the provision of drones to Russia and Ukraine. But we're also seeing more like-mindedness, if you will, inside Syria. Areas where the Russians have been forced to pull back, the Iranians are filling those security vacuums. The Russians had prior played more of a role of sort of regulating, in quotation marks, the Iranian presence, in large part because of their relations with Israel. That, too, has seen really important shifts, particularly during Prime Minister Lapid's turn in power, where the tensions between Russia and Israel were rising, I think, in significant ways and being played out kinetically inside Syria. And then lastly, I think we can't forget the ways in which Turkey has become more emboldened. Turkey has played a role of essentially played a mediating role in the Ukraine crisis and is leveraging that in many ways. It's leveraging its NATO role. And what we're seeing in the Syria context is an emboldened Turkey that is threatening to make yet another incursion into northeast Syria. We've seen these threats earlier in the year, but now, because of the shift in power dynamics, there may be a greater likelihood that Turkey will undertake that, given its I think the Turks have decided that the Russians need them more than they need Russia.
So interesting. Ambassador Ross, help us understand Israel's position towards Russia today and the war in Ukraine. You know that Prime Minister Zelensky has been vocal about his disappointment with Israel, and he, in fact, said that Israeli neutrality has encouraged Russia's partnership with Iran. You think that's true?
So, from an Israeli perspective, Russia has been on their border. There are S-300s and S-400s in Syria. These are advanced, long-range air defense systems. Israel is dealing with an Iran that is trying to put precision guidance on a significant portion of the 200,000 missiles that Hezbollah now has within Lebanon. So from an Israeli standpoint, they need freedom of action over Syria to be able to blunt what Iran is trying to do and build up further within Lebanon, plus to build up their own presence within Syria itself. So the Israeli concern is, we didn't invite the Russians to go into Syria. You, the U.S., didn't do much about that. We now face a real constraint. If we act in a way that Putin decides he's going to start turning on those radars, we're going to find it much more difficult for us to carry out what we need to do vis-a-vis the Iranians. We don't really want to have to go in there and destroy the Russian manned S-400s. They pulled the S-300s out because of Ukraine, but the S-400s are still there. So there's been this dilemma, and Mona is quite right. Lapid's position was different than Bennett's. Now, it could have been a good cop, bad cop reality, but Lapid was much more vocal on just the sheer, he actually put the sheer evil of what the Russians were doing, and that Israel had to be on the right side of history on this one, which, by the way, was where the Israeli public has been, because they identify with Ukraine being attacked by the Russians. And interestingly enough, most of the Israelis who have come from Russia have also supported the position of the Ukrainians. So there was a political dynamic within Israel that supported what Lapid was doing. Bennett's position was to say, look, we need to be nuanced, we need to be balanced. Now, the question becomes even more interesting because even though the Likud party today asked for an extension of another 2 weeks to be able to put together the government, the coalition negotiations, I think, going on in Israel are a little bit like sausage making at this point. And so the Likud has asked for an extension of 2 weeks to put together the government. Netanyahu prided himself on the relationship he had with Putin. He was invited to Red Square, for the victory in the Great Patriotic War. The interesting question will be, where is he now? Is his position going to be closer to what Bennett was suggesting, or what Lapid was? Was the Bennett-Lapid relationship really an orchestrated one, which it may have been? My suspicion is the concern about the Russians will remain. And by the way, it's not only because of what I just said in terms of Syria. There's also 600,000 Jews in Russia. And the concern about what may happen to the Jews in Russia is also a factor that influences what any Israeli prime minister is going to do on this. So my suspicion is the Israelis will continue to do more in the non-lethal area. They will be very hesitant to go beyond that level. If you ask people in the administration, they will say, we want the Israelis to do more in terms of air defense. Now, it's easy to say that. The question is, what does that mean in practice? You'll hear the term Iron Dome, which is Israel has a layered missile defense system. The Arrow is an interceptor for outside the atmosphere. David Sling is for short-range kinds of attacks, and Iron Dome is for something in between. Iron Dome is very effective, but the Israelis will say, we don't have enough for ourselves. We face the risk of another conflict coming out of Gaza. We face the potential of Hezbollah. If we provide Iron Dome to the Ukrainians, put aside the issue of the relationship or the impact with the Russians, we won't have enough for ourselves if we face another conflict. And they'll say, look, we understand America is doing a lot for Ukraine, but by the way, you're not providing patriots there. Why? Because you don't have enough patriots. So this is an area where I think the administration will continue talking to the Israelis, and a creative approach would probably be one where we ask the Israelis to do more to help in air defense, not by doing it directly with Ukraine, but by giving it to NATO partners who could use more help from the Israelis in terms of beefing up early warning capabilities.
Thank you for that. Enrique, Mona talked about the perception in the Middle East that the U.S. is leaving. Is it the concern or the position or the belief in Brussels that Russia is filling that space?
No, it is definitely it's not Russia who could fill that gap. As far as Iran is concerned, Iran has a 25-year treaty with China, who virtually put the Iranian economy in the hands of China. Today, we have, as Mona mentioned, for 3 days, Xi Jinping is in Riyadh. He's having summits, 3 summits, with the Arab League, with the Gulf Cooperation Council, and a bilateral one with Saudi Arabia. No leader in the world has had such a treatment. And at the same time, he's the first and most reliable ally of Iran. This is filling the gap. That diplomacy is filling the gap, not the Russians. What is going on between Russia and Iran is purely circumstantial. We are pushing both the Ukrainians and the Iranians to talk. They have already met 3 times, only last week. And we think it's the way out to this situation. For us, the important thing, the existential threat is the war in Ukraine, and we will do whatever is in our hands to diminish the risk. And one of them, obviously, is to stop Iran transferring weapons to Russia. So that can be done through that bilateral contact. Is so far so good. So again, Russia is not going to fill any gap. As for Israel, yes, I mean, we can understand all this. Ambassador Ross put it very eloquently. At the same time, who would not prefer Israel to be in this global West effort? We are all together, from Australia to Sweden to Canada, you name it. We would like to see Israel in that common effort. We can understand the constraints. These constraints, by the way, are quite similar to those invoked by Turkey, and we don't understand Turkey, so that's the situation then.
Ambassador Ross, let me just ask you to pick up on that, because I wanted to ask you your thoughts, and this is obviously going to be a test for Netanyahu again, and how he changes or relates with Putin now, because the invasion hadn't happened yet when the last time Netanyahu was in power. 4 weeks ago, Tom Friedman penned an opinion piece in the Times with this headline: "The Israel we knew is gone." Do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree with it. Let's try to put the election in perspective, which is not to say I'm comfortable with its outcome, although I'm not an Israeli and I didn't vote. The actual outcome, the actual numbers outcome, ended up with, if you want to put it this way, the anti-Netanyahu bloc, because this was an election that basically was not between parties as much as it was between blocs. The anti-Netanyahu bloc won 24,000 more votes than the pro-Netanyahu bloc, if you want to put it that way. I mean, it's not, obviously, it's not a perfect analogy, but to explain it in our terms, it's like the Democrats winning the popular vote and losing in the Electoral College. What happened was that Netanyahu was extremely good at making sure there were no splits in the parties on the right wing, because if you fall below 3.25%, all those votes are simply lost. So none of the right-wing parties fell below that threshold. One left-wing party, Meretz, and one Arab party, Balad, which is actually an anti-Zionist party, they came extremely close. In the case of Meretz, they were 3.2%, barely falling below, and that meant all those votes were lost. Balad came in at 3%, or close to 3.1%. All those votes were lost. Balad had previously run as part of the joint list with two other Arab parties. So you ended up losing all those votes, and that shifted the balance in a way that produced a majority. So 64 effectively for this emerging government to 56, in a sense, who were against, including the joint list. So this is a government that in terms of numbers looks stable. But the fact that getting the government put together so you can actually be in place is requiring an extension suggests that this is not going to be such an easy marriage. And obviously many of the values of this government, we're seeing some of the religious parties say that they don't want to allow non-Orthodox, and they don't want to allow women to go to the wall. Well, you know, that's going to have an impact on Israel that still remains more secular than not. They are they're seeking to adopt positions that will raise basic questions about a lot of the fundamental values that most Israelis still share. Prime Minister Netanyahu is the longest-serving Israeli prime minister. He's now 73. He doesn't want, I would say, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich to define his legacy, so he's going to have a real challenge. But you can look at what are the things you know for certain that he'll try to contain. He takes enormous pride in the Abraham Accords. He's not going to let them undo it. And there are steps that they could take that would threaten it. For example, there was a commitment there'd be no annexation of the territories allotted to Israel under the Trump plan for 4 years. If there's an effort at annexation, that's going to bring down the Abraham Accords. He won't permit that. There are those within this coalition who want to change, increase Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif. He knows you do that, it won't just be the Abraham Accords. He wants to produce a breakthrough with Saudi Arabia. If you change the status quo on the Temple Mount, on the Haram al-Sharif, this is the one thing, I will say that Arab leaders in general don't have the same level of concern for Palestinians that they may have had historically. But if you touch the religious sites, that's electric. That will trigger a great public reaction. And no Arab government will be able to ignore that. So he knows that. I mean, he actually, at one point, after stabbings of a couple of border police, he put magnetometers onto the Temple Mount. It produced such a reaction that he withdrew them. So that's tame compared to really changing the status quo. So my point is, we'll have to see what, in fact, he'll be able to do to contain those who want to push for a genuine, serious right-wing agenda. Smotrich, who will be the finance minister, is someone who believes if he can't implement a right-wing agenda now, it'll never be implemented. So he's going to be pushing against what I was describing, Netanyahu is going to be resisting. And how that gets managed is something we're going to have to see.
Makes our politics seem so easy. Mona, can you talk a little bit about the Abraham Accords and the impact it's had regionally? I mean, I understand the impact, I think we all do, for Israel.
Well, I think, you know, the impact is one thing at an official government level, and there I think, you know, it's been quite an important breakthrough. But another entirely at a popular level. And we saw reporting out of the World Cup in Qatar and the kind of interaction between Arabs, Tunisians, Moroccans, and others there to watch the games with Israeli journalists in particular, where there was a continued insistence on raising the Palestinian issue, the Palestinian cause, I think the jury is very much going to be out, depending on exactly what happens inside Israel, how the new government addresses and deals with Palestinians, what happens in the territories, if there's a lot more violence, if there's a lot more repression. I think it's going to be very, very hard for the Abraham Accords to sort of make the continued slow progress they were making. I think it's going to be quite difficult.
Professor Milani, can you talk a little bit about that? So how it's being seen in Iran and what the impact would be on an Israeli deal with the Saudis, a hoped for, always kind of out there desire?
I think we have two Irans. The people of Iran, I think, are very happy that the Abrahamic Accords are happening. Jews have lived in Iran for 3,000 years. They've been an inseparable part of our culture. Iran still has the biggest number of Jews living in a Muslim world. So for the Iranian people, affinity with Israel, even an alliance with Israel, is a very natural thing. For this regime, it defines itself by its animosity to Israel. So for the regime, it is tightening of the encirclement, they feel. For the people, I think it's a good sign that the regime's policies have failed. But I can't not point to one small important fact that, in my view, underscores the lack of a U.S. strategy in the region. Compare President Biden's visit to Saudi Arabia to what the ambassador just explained about China's visit. There are two main players in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and Iran. Both are wooing China. Both are offering China deals that they have never, in Iran's history, I have never seen a deal offered to another country as sweet a deal as China. So going back to your point.
Could I just jump in on that? Because I think it's such an important point.
Mona, take the last word.
Professor Milani's making, which is essentially the U.S. really does need to develop a strategy and a vision for the region, for this new region that is emerging. There's a widespread, I think, view that the U.S. doesn't have a plan, the U.S. doesn't have a vision, and you do see the Chinese. It's not the Russians, it's the Chinese we need to be watching out for.
Well, on that hopeful note, please let me thank our panelists.